Many people in positions of influence and authority in academic life today believe that universities should be in the forefront of producing young men and women who will be social activists. More than a few seem to be eager to transform university education into a species of vocational training for aspiring ACLU lawyers, Planned Parenthood volunteers, social justice warriors, and community organizers. There are indeed some colleges and universities that even offer academic credit for social activism. Others, however, resist that idea, or the idea that learning should be instrumentalized in this way. They profess allegiance to the traditional, or at least traditional-sounding, idea that the point of liberal education is to enrich and even liberate the student learner. That's what's supposed to be liberal about liberal arts learning, liberal education. It's supposed to convey knowledge and impart the intellectual skills and habits of mind that carry with them a certain profound form of freedom. Now, however traditional this may sound, there's nevertheless an unbridgeable chasm between the idea of liberal arts education as classically conceived and the conception sponsored and promoted by some, though mercifully not all, in positions of influence in academic departments across the United States today, especially at secular or non-sectarian state and private universities. Many academic humanists and social scientists working in contemporary higher education propose as the goal of liberal arts learning, liberation, to be sure, but the question is, liberation from what? In their conception, what I'll call now the revisionist conception, it's liberation from traditional, biblically rooted social constraints and norms of morality, the beliefs, the principles, the structures by which earlier generations of Americans and people in the West more generally had been taught to govern their conduct for the sake of personal virtue and the common good. Now, why do they regard this form of liberation as desirable? Well, it's because it's become a matter of dogma that these traditional norms and structures are irrational. They're vestiges, people claim, of superstition and phobia. They impede people's embracing their true identities and the free development of their personalities by restricting their capacities to act on their desires. In this dogmatic context, and it is a dogmatic context, the purpose of liberal arts learning is to undermine whatever's left of the old norms and structures. To accomplish that task, teaching and scholarship are meant either to, one, expose the texts and traditions once regarded as the intellectual treasures of our civilization, the Bible, Plato, Augustine, Dante, Aquinas, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Locke, Montesquieu, Austin, Goethe, the authors of the Federalist, as mere works of propaganda meant to support and reinforce unjust, racist, sexist, classist, homophobic social orders. Or, yet more insidiously, in my opinion, to show how the old texts and traditions can be reappropriated and used as tools to subvert alleged or allegedly unjust, racist, sexist, and so forth, contemporary social orders. And beyond this, liberal arts learning is meant to enable students to become truly authentic individuals, people who are true to themselves. Now, here the question is, what is the self to which the authentic person is true? What counts as your self? For those in the grip of this new liberationist and identitarian ideology, to be true to oneself is to act on one's feelings or desires. Indeed, what one fundamentally is, according to this worldview, is one's feelings and desire. What's at the core of your identity? What makes you you? Your feelings and desires. So authenticity, that is being true to oneself, is understood to consist in doing what you really want to do, in defiance, if necessary, of expectations based on putatively outmoded, retrograde, biblical, Christian, moral ideas and social norms. Now, according to this conception of personal authenticity, whatever impedes one from doing what one truly wants to do is a mere hang-up, something that holds one back from being true to oneself, from being the person one truly is. Such impediments, be they religious convictions, moral ideals, or what have you, are to be transcended for the sake of the free and full development of one's personality. The very essence of liberation as reconceived by partisans of the revisionist conception of liberal arts education is transcending these so-called hang-ups. Now, nowhere is this clearer than in freshman orientation programs in many colleges and universities throughout the United States, including my own at Princeton, that feature compulsory events designed to undermine any lingering allegiance to traditional norms of morality and decency that the new students may bring with them from home. These events are largely, to be very frank with you, exercises in liberationist propaganda, however much they may be advertised by university officials as efforts to discourage sexual harassment or racism or unwanted pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases or bullying or what have you. Most of them are utterly one-sided. Dissenting views are never aired. The point seems to be to send the clearest possible message to students who may dissent from the prevailing liberationist and identitarian orthodoxy that they are outsiders who had better conform or keep their mouths shut. Now, of course, what goes on in these programs and in far too many classrooms is radically different from the classical understanding of what liberal arts education is supposed to accomplish. The understanding, by the way, that informs and animates the Torrey Honors College here. Formally, as a formality, the classical and revisionist conceptions seem similar. Both propose liberal arts learning as liberating. Both promise to enable the learner to achieve a greater measure of personal authenticity. But in substance, they could not be farther apart. The classical understanding of the goal of liberal arts learning is to liberate us not to act on our desires, but rather precisely to liberate us from slavery to them, slavery to our desires. Personal authenticity on the traditional account consists in self-mastery, in placing reason in control of feeling, reason in control of desire. According to the classic liberal arts ideal, then, learning promises liberation, but it is not liberation from demanding moral ideals and social norms. It's rather liberation from slavery to self. Now, how can it be true? How can it be liberating to enter into the great conversation with, say, Plato and his interlocutors? What's freeing? What frees us in thinking along with Sophocles or Plato or Aristotle, Augustine, Dante, Aquinas, Austin, Mill? Beyond being entertained by Shakespeare's charm and wit and astonishing intellectual deftness, why should we make the effort to understand and appreciate his works? What's the point of that? What's the good in it? Well, according to the classic liberal arts ideal, our critical engagement with the great thinkers enriches our understanding and enables us to grasp more fully great truths. Truths that when we appropriate them and integrate them into our lives, liberate us from what is merely vulgar, coarse, base. These are soul-shaping, humanizing truths. Truths whose appreciation and secure possession elevates reason above passion and appetite, enabling us to direct our desires and our wills toward what is truly good, truly worthwhile, truly beautiful, truly wantable, and away from their opposites. It directs us toward what is truly for the flourishing of human beings as possessors of a profound and inherent dignity. So the classic liberal arts proposition is that intellectual knowledge has a very important role to play in making possible what might be called self-transcendence, rising above one's desires, appetites, and feelings, and being in control of oneself. It can help us to understand what is good and to love the good above whatever it is we happen to desire, and it can teach us to desire what is good because it is good, thus making us truly masters of ourselves. Now, these contrasting and conflicting views of what liberal learning is supposed to liberate us from reflect competing understandings of what human beings fundamentally are and what it's possible for us as human beings to be and become. I have spoken of the soul-shaping power of truths, but on the revisionist view, there neither is nor can be any such thing as the rational soul. There is merely a self. And the self, the soulless self, is constituted not by powers of rationality that enable us to know what is humanly good and morally right and direct our desires toward it, but rather by the desires themselves. Reason's role in our conduct can be then nothing more than instrumental. Reason cannot tell us what to want, but only how to get what we want, whatever we happen to want. As David Hume, and I know some of you have recently been reading Hume, the great 18th century skeptical British philosopher, as Hume articulated the claim, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them. Sometimes it's suggested that it was the convention-flouting, colorful figure of Jean-Jacques Rousseau who, above all others, inspired the trend of belief that reached its full flower in the 1960s and still colors the contemporary identitarian imagination. I wonder, though, whether the greater blame should fall on staid, old, so-called conservative David Hume. In any event, if the Humean understanding is the correct one, then the rational soul is an illusion, and belief in it and in the truths that can liberate us from slavery to our desires is something not unlike a superstition. Although Hume himself didn't draw the conclusion, human fulfillment just as such would seem to consist not in self-mastery, not in overcoming desires that run contrary to what reason identifies as what is good and right, but rather in freeing ourselves from the allegedly irrational inhibitions, those hang-ups, that impede us from doing as we please, acting on our feelings, acting on our desires. Hence that imbecilic slogan that will ever stand as the sort of verbal monument to the me generation, if it feels good, do it. The true liberal arts ideal rejects the reduction of reason to the status of passion's ingenious servant. It's an ideal rooted in the conviction that there are human goods and a common good in light of which we have reason to constrain, to limit, to regulate, and even to alter, to revise our desires. It proposes the study of the great works of the humanities and social sciences with a view to grasping more fully these goods and the reasons they provide, and to understanding them in their wholeness, that is, integrally. What liberal arts learning offers us is truly an audacious hope, the hope of self-mastery. But can it really be true? What could there be in us or about us that could actually make it possible for human beings to be masters of their desires, feelings, emotions, passions, and not mere slaves to them? Well, only this mysterious thing that Plato's Socrates was so centrally concerned about, and that so many great thinkers and writers of the Western intellectual tradition from Plato forward have sought to understand and teach us about, namely the soul. Soulless selves could have desires and even a certain form of purely instrumental rationality directed toward achieving the efficient satisfaction of our desires, but soulless selves could never be masters of their desires. Only by virtue of our rational souls can we exercise the more than merely instrumental form of rationality that enables us, unlike the brute animals, to be masters of our desires and mere slaves to self. We don't expect the lioness hunting the gazelle to be master of her desires. But we human beings are not brute animals like the lioness. We can be masters of ourselves. Now, of course, if you believe in such things as reasons, the consideration of which has the power to constrain desire, If you believe that, then what you're looking for, what you're trying to understand and know, are virtues. You're seeking answers to the question, what qualities make for an honorable, worthy, upright life? That's a very different question from the question, what do I want? What do I desire? Think of the chasm between those questions. What do I want? What do I desire? And the question, what qualities make for an honorable, worthy, upright life? What are the habits and the traits of character that we should cultivate in ourselves so as to be masters of our passions rather than slaves to our feelings and desires? The true founder of the liberal arts ideal was indeed Socrates, as presented by his student Plato. And Socrates' method of teaching, as you all know, was to question. He's the great exemplar of what the late Alan Bloom labeled the interrogatory attitude, an attitude that even defenders of the classical liberal arts ideal sometimes fail to exhibit and inculcate in their students. The liberal arts ideal assumes, to be sure, that there are right answers to the great moral and existential questions. It's the enemy, not the friend, of moral relativism. But liberal arts teaching is not fundamentally about telling students what the right answers are. Not at Princeton, not at Torrey, not anywhere. Even when we are justifiably confident that we have the right answers, the role of liberal arts learning is to encourage students to ask the right questions and think for themselves about what the right answers are. Liberal arts learning is not just about receiving and processing information, even if it's great information, such as historic facts about the American founding or something like that, or the Civil War, what have you. Vital though that is. It's not just about reading Aristotle or Chaucer or Shakespeare and knowing what these great writers said so that you can get an A on the test. It's about engaging with those great writers, thinking along with them, questioning, wrestling with them and with the questions that they themselves wrestled with. It's about considering their arguments, what can be gleaned from their work, what can be learned. It's about considering the best possible lines of counter-argument and examining alternative points of view with everything on the table. Yes, read Aristotle, but also read Nietzsche. You say, Professor George, why should we as Christians read Nietzsche, the great atheist, the enemy of Christianity? Because we learn from our critics. Because we learn from engaging the best that's been thought and said on competing sides, even of questions that are critically important to us and questions on which we're committed to certain answers. And the range of alternatives available to students needs to be wide. Liberal arts education, even in religiously affiliated institutions like Biola, is not catechism class. There's a place for catechism class. The university's not that place. Students should not simply be presented with officially approved views, even if they're the right views. This is why freedom of thought, inquiry, and discussion are, as John Stuart Mill rightly taught, the great English thinker of the 19th century, so critical. So I want my students to consider seriously a range of possibilities, including some, Marxism for example, that I think are not only unsound, but reprehensible, and whose record in human affairs is a record of death and abomination. That's the record of Marxism, and yet I assign Marx to my students. I want them to wrestle with him and also to appreciate the profound arguments made against his view by people like Friedrich Hayek and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the late Pope John Paul II. But I also want them to understand how it could be that Marxism attracted the allegiance of so many intelligent and even morally serious, if indeed misguidedly serious, people. I want them to know the arguments Marx and his most brilliant disciples, people like Antonio Gramsci, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, made. In fact, I want them to consider these arguments fairly on their merits. The task of the liberal arts teacher, as I envisage it, is not to tell students what to think, it's to teach them to think more deeply, more carefully, more critically, including self-critically, and for themselves. Now, why? Is it because I think there's something intrinsically valuable about the interrogatory attitude? No. The point of the interrogatory attitude, rather, is precisely to move from ignorance to truths, or to a deeper understanding of truths, truths that can be affirmed and acted on. Now, we begin to understand the much misunderstood and abused concept of academic freedom when we consider the central importance of the interrogative attitude to the enterprise of liberal arts learning. The interrogative attitude can only flourish under conditions of freedom. It can be smothered not only by formal restrictions on freedom of thought and discussion, but also by informal pressures to conform, whether applied by teachers or peers or the broader culture. That's a point made again by Mill. Some of you in the class session for Torrey that I met with the other day read Mill's second chapter of On Liberty, where he makes precisely this point. Now, although some people have depicted freedom and truth as antithetical to each other, in reality, freedom and truth are mutually supportive and indeed dependent on each other. The defense of academic freedom and the interrogative attitude must, implicitly at least, appeal to the concept of truth, and any plausible and complete case for academic freedom will present understanding, knowledge, and truth as the intrinsic values and virtues that ground the intelligibility of freedom as something indispensable to their pursuit and meaningful appropriation. On the other side of the question, the overwhelming evidence of history, not to mention the plain evidence under our noses when we examine the contemporary situation in most universities, shows that freedom is as necessary to the intellectual life as oxygen is to our bodily lives. Now, no one is saying that freedom of speech should be boundless. There are some limitations. You shouldn't be able to threaten people, intimidate people, practice extortion, incite violence. But the legitimate scope of expression has to be wide, even in religiously affiliated universities. The scope of that freedom as a value that is ordered to truth must be generous, especially in academic institutions where free inquiry, exploration, experimentation are often essential to insight and richer understanding. Even within its legitimate bounds, can academic freedom be abused? Well, sure, of course it can be, and all too often it is. Academic freedom doesn't guarantee excellence or even passable scholarship or teaching. Sometimes respect for it insulates abuses from correction. But again, the lessons of history and our current situation are clear. Repression of academic freedom and freedom of speech more broadly, far from shielding us from error or protecting truth, undermines the very process of truth-seeking. But someone might say, someone on the left or on the right might say, look, Professor George, there are many truths that we know. We know them securely. Why should we permit them to be denied and questioned? Why not take the view that error, or at least clear error, has no rights? Otherwise, doesn't the defense of academic freedom collapse into the self-stultifying denial of the possibility of truth? Doesn't it make freedom rather than truth the ultimate value? And certainly we shouldn't do that. No Christian would approve of that. Well, I've already mentioned that some participants or partisans of academic freedom misguidedly depict truth as the enemy of freedom. Again, on the left and on the right. They appeal to or presuppose a species of relativism or subjectivism or radical skepticism in defending freedom of inquiry. Now, it's certainly true that one reason for respecting academic freedom and freedom of speech is that people can be mistaken about what they regard, even securely regard, as true. Indeed, for all of us, as frail, fallible, fallen human beings, even unanimity of belief doesn't guarantee correctness. We could all believe the same thing and be dead wrong about it. We could all believe the same thing and be completely missing the truth. But I think the possibility of error is not the primary or most powerful reason for honoring freedom of speech and protecting it even in areas where we are secure in our knowledge of the truth. The stronger and deeper reason is that freedom is the condition of our fuller appropriation of the truth. Now, perhaps you noticed I used that word appropriation earlier in this talk. And I use that term because knowledge and truth have their value for human beings precisely as fulfillments of capacities for understanding and judgment that we have in virtue of our rational natures. The liberal arts are liberating of the human spirit because knowledge of truth attained by the exercise of our rational faculties, our faculties for inquiry, understanding, judgment, is intrinsically and not merely instrumentally valuable. Now, useful knowledge is all to the good. And it's wonderful when human knowledge can serve other goods, such as health in the biomedical sciences, or economic efficiency, or building great buildings and bridges, or a million other worthy, useful purposes. But even useful knowledge is often more than merely instrumentally valuable, and a great deal of knowledge that wouldn't qualify as useful in the instrumental sense is intrinsically and profoundly enriching and liberating. A lot of what we learn from reading Shakespeare isn't useful to some extrinsic end, but it is certainly intrinsically enriching. And this is why we honor and should honor even more highly than we currently do in our institutions of higher learning, excellence in the humanities and in pure science, natural and social. Knowledge that elevates us, that enriches us, knowledge that liberates the human spirit, cannot be merely notional. It can't just be receiving passive information. It must be appropriated, brought into our lives, deeply understood. It must be formative of us. It is not or cannot be merely a matter of affirming or even believing correct propositions, checking the right box on the multiple choice test. The knowledge that elevates, that liberates, is knowledge not only that something is the case, but knowledge of why it is the case, or how it is the case, or how it relates to other things that are the case. I mean, it's one thing and a good thing to know that something is true, but it's a richer and better and deeper thing to know why it's true, how it relates to other important truths, and to explore the questions that are opened when we arrive at a truth. Truth often doesn't stop inquiry. It opens new lines of inquiry. And typically such knowledge really does open us to new avenues of exploration. Its payoff really does include new sets of questions, new lines of inquiry. To return then finally to the question, why respect freedom even when truth is, as far as we can tell, securely known to us? It's because freedom to inquire, freedom to assent or withhold one's assent, as best one's judgment dictates. It's a condition of the personal appropriation of truth by the human subject, by the human knower. The human person for the sake of whom, for the flourishing of whom, for the liberation of whom, knowledge of truth is intrinsically valuable. And it is intrinsically valuable not in some free-floating or abstract sense, but precisely as an aspect of the well-being and fulfillment of human beings, rational creatures of a rational nature, whose flourishing consists in part in intellectual inquiry, understanding, and judgment, and in the practice of the virtues which makes possible excellence in the intellectual domain. So the freedom we must defend, the freedom that we must honor, the freedom we must proclaim to the world is not some abstract freedom. It's not the freedom to do what you want or act on your desires. It's the freedom to practice these virtues. It is freedom for something as well as freedom from something. And that something that freedom is freedom for is excellence, self-transcendence, the freedom that enables us to be masters of ourselves and not mere slaves. It's a freedom that, far from being negated by rigorous standards of morality, demands them. It is not the freedom of, if it feels good, do it. It is rather the freedom of self-transcendence, the freedom from slavery to self. And with that, let me offer you once again my thanks, and especially to you young men and women, my blessing as you go out into the world to proclaim the good news in all its fullness and its richness as alumni someday of Biola. Thank you.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.